we've got Dr. Joe Wan joining us and he's in Taipei at the moment at the National Taiwan University. Yep. And so Joe completed his PhD at ETH in Zurich, working with Tom Crowther, where he studied the implications of community interactions for carbon cycling. And he's now a postdoc in the K Lab, working with Bo K at the National Taiwan University. And his work is focused on adapting coexistence theory to address a broader range of systems and questions, which I think we're going to hear a little bit about today. So take it away, Joe. The floor is yours.
Great. Yeah, thanks so much, Courtney, for the introduction and for setting things up and for making this seminar series possible. Can everybody see and hear me all right?
We can't see your screen yet.
Okay. Yes, working on it. 1 second. Okay. Here we should have the screen. All good?
Yeah, that looks good. Yeah.
Okay, thanks so much. Sorry for the hiccup. Yeah, okay, well, thanks everyone for making time to attend my seminar. What I'm going to be talking about today is a unified theory of community structure. And so I want to start with discussing just sort of the different scales from which we approach ecology. And typically these are different ways of looking at systems, but they also form different subdisciplines. And so we might start at sort of at species interactions and the sort of roots of population ecology. Moving on, the second, we might have communities, which is considering the diversity of living things that share a habitat. We might look at ecosystems, which looks at those living things as a whole component and looks at how that biotic component cycles energy and nutrients. And finally, we might look at the entire Earth system, which is looking at those same biogeochemical fluxes on the scale of the entire Earth. And of course, we know that these aren't different things in the real world. In the real world, we have a continuum of processes and scales, and these are just different ways that we study them. And so, of course, when you want to address questions like global change, it's incredibly important that we have the ability to move between these different perspectives. For instance, we know that global change can perturb species interactions, and those changes in species interactions can sort of feed up through the community and ecosystem levels until they affect the very biogeochemical fluxes that cause and drive global change. And so, of course, this isn't a new perspective. There's been a lot of productive work on sort of crossing scales with the hopes of addressing global change. And one of those interfaces, which I think is particularly active, and the one I'm going to talk to you about today, is the interface between community and ecosystem ecology. And sort of with the goal of addressing global change, one successful body of research is called biodiversity ecosystem function, which aims to answer this question: do more diverse communities have higher function? And basically, decades of well-designed experiments have shown that basically, yes, the more species you assemble in an experimental plot, the higher levels of functioning that community tends to show. Typically, this is done in grassland communities. And typically, the function that we're interested in is productivity, for instance. But generally, there's this positive biodiversity function relationship. However, we have sort of questions about this relationship, right? How will the relationship between diversity and functioning persist or change over time, for instance? Or how does that relationship depend on environmental context? And so that's where I think the tools that we have from population and community ecology can really come in. And what I particularly want to highlight today is a body of work called modern coexistence theory. Many of you are familiar with it or work on it. And this body of theory asks, how do species interactions maintain diversity? And so the key word here, I think, is maintain, because modern coexistence theory considers those species interactions that are responsible for driving changes in the community and its function. This might provide a mechanistic basis from which to better understand the temporal changes or the context dependence of biodiversity function relationships. However, there's one big problem, and that's what I'm hoping to address today in this seminar. And the problem is we lack the general theory in order to study the the structure and function of communities. And what I mean by that, for instance, is that modern coexistence is a theory for studying coexistence, of course. And when we study coexistence, we're interested in whether multiple species can persist over long periods of time. And crucially, that question concerns the number of species, not their abundance. However, we know that the abundance of different species in an ecosystem matters for total function, because more abundant species tend on average or in general to contribute more to the entire functioning of the ecosystem. And meanwhile, though, we have theories like neutral theory from Hubble, which can predict properties of species distributions. They're also not entirely suited to this question of studying community structure and function with the aim of addressing global change because, for instance, neutral theory assumes that species are functionally equivalent. And we know that species identity is also very important for understanding the total function of an ecosystem. And finally, the biodiversity manipulation experiments that I mentioned earlier typically use something like, well, the grassland experiment might use between 10 and 50 species. And we know that in real ecosystems, the order of magnitude of species diversity can be much, much higher. And so with these challenges in mind, we might say that, okay, well, what if we just take the Volterra model, for instance, and calculate the equilibrium? Won't that tell us something about the structure of a community? But even for a simple three-species community, we see that it's actually quite hard to interpret the expression for the equilibrium abundance. So while we could use this to understand how much this particular species contributes to the entire community, it's hard to derive biological insight that we can then generalize to larger scales. And with a reasonable four-species community, it's already impossible to really say anything about this expression here. So what I'm going to do today is to go a different route and to try to start from the conceptual tools and the quantitative methods of modern coexistence theory and build towards a theory that can address multi-species communities and that can address the structure and function, that is the species abundances and the total abundance. And so to do so, I'll start by introducing these concepts from coexistence theory. For some of you, this might be a review. For others, it might be a quick introduction to the theory, hopefully. Next, I'll look to simple models of two species and using classical models such as the Volterra functional form. I'll then, in this case, start to explore these fundamental connections between species coexistence and ecosystem structure and function. Next, in order to sort of incorporate more realism, I'll extend these results to any model. And I'll do so for two-species communities still in this two-species world. And I'll do so by introducing a concept known as non-additivity in order to explore models beyond those classic cases. And finally, using methods from statistical mechanics, I will extend that further to address ecosystems with more than two species, and hopefully in doing so produce a unified theory of community structure and function. And I'll talk a bit about current work I am doing with collaborators to hopefully show how this theory can tell us, help us answer ecological questions across these vast differences in scales. So let's start with this modern coexistence theory, right? So we're studying coexistence, and coexistence is also known as the maintenance of diversity. And essentially, we're studying whether or not multiple species or two species can persist indefinitely over long periods of time. They share a habitat. And the quantitative tool we use to study that property is known as the invasion growth rate or invasion analysis. And this acts as a common currency for coexistence. So basically, we start from some community without the species of interest, and this is known as the resident species or community. And we allow that species, for the two-species case, to come to some equilibrium. Then we introduce the species of interest and measure its per capita growth rate. Now, when both of these species in this two-species system have positive per capita growth rates, or invasion growth rates in this case, we then conclude that the two species can coexist. That is, mathematically speaking, their abundances are bounded to be in this positive region here. Moreover, we can take this information provided by invasion growth rate, and we can summarize it in ways that provide additional biological insight. So modern coexistence theory gives us this recipe for diversity. And specifically, we say that coexistence requires species to have different niches, but similar fitness. And so different niches means that competition between species, competition within species will be stronger than between species. Whereas similar fitness refers to the compatibility of species and ensures that their competitive hierarchy is not too strong to prevent coexistence. And we can then quantify these variable components using the invasion growth rate. So by taking some sort of average of transferred invasion growth rates, for instance, we could calculate the niche difference for this community to be 0.07, and we could plot this on the axis, this x-axis here. However, that's not the only component, right? So we also have to consider fitness, these competitive hierarchies. And so we can calculate fitness as the difference of transformed invasion growth rates as 0.04, and then plot this point here. Essentially, the condition for coexistence is that the magnitude of fitness difference has to be less than niche difference. And so for this amount of niche differentiation, we would say that this range of fitness differences allows coexistence. And plotting the entire conditions that would allow coexistence, we get this gray region here. So essentially, any community can be any community of two species at least can be represented by a point on this plane, and points within that region can coexist. However, when we're outside of that region, the species with higher fitness will competitively exclude its partner. And the problem I mentioned earlier, right? So community composition in this theory is a black box. The quantitative tools we have for proving coexistence only ensure that the abundance is really positive. They don't directly say anything about what those abundances will be. However, as I said earlier, it's important to know the relative abundances of a species, for instance, to know their contribution to entire ecosystem function. And so we would actually like to know the interior equilibrium, the actual abundances of each species at equilibrium. This question becomes especially hard in the multi-species case. And so the goal today is to open this black box that we have when studying coexistence using invasion growth rates. And doing so to link this invasion growth rate that's at the base of modern coexistence theory to the interior equilibrium of a community. And in doing so, we would then be able to finally link these ecosystem and community scales using rigorous quantitative theory. And so in summary, coexistence theory consists of these quantitative components: invasion growth, niche difference, and fitness difference, which we'll be using today to then extend these results to ecosystem function into multi-species communities. So we'll start in the two-species world, and we'll start with classical models, as I mentioned. In order to link coexistence to ecosystem function and to study the structure of a community, we'll ask this question: when does competition promote the total function of an ecosystem? And so if we have two species, we might consider those two species in a community together and communities consisting of each species growing alone. We're interested today in the conditions for something known as overyielding, or more specifically, transgressive overyielding, which is when the total function, in this case productivity, of the two species growing together is greater than that of the best single species alone. And to link coexistence to this outcome of overyielding, we can use the following key insight, that the invasion growth rate can relate coexistence to equilibrium abundance in these simple two-species systems. And so we have the following expressions for the equilibrium abundance and the niche difference in the system, which are in terms of the invasion growth rate scaled by R, the intrinsic growth rate. And for instance, we find the abundance by then multiplying that by K, the carrying capacity, or the function of a species growing alone. Throughout this talk today, I'll be writing this quantity IGR over R as F. So this is the invasion growth rate scaled by some quantity. And this serves as a metric of species competitive ability or ability to persist. So I'll be calling this invasion-based fitness or scaled invasion growth rate. But this measures the same thing as the invasion growth rate that I've been mentioning. And basically, using this relationship, we can then derive this equation for this inequality that gives the niche and fitness differences that allow overyielding. And to do so, we also need to pay attention to the differences between the functional abilities of the species when going alone, and that's these K values. So the productivity or other function of each species when it grows in a community by itself. And with that information, we can then visualize the conditions that allow overyielding graphically. So here we're starting from these conditions for coexistence. The magnitude of niche difference is less than fitness. The magnitude of fitness difference is less than niche difference. And we add this information about productivity so that we say the species that's upwards on the x-axis is more productive and the one that's downwards is less productive. If we visualize the conditions for over-yielding, we see that it looks like this. And we can note that this region is to the right of the original region. And that indicates that one condition for over-yielding is that it requires even more niche difference than required for these species just to coexist. Similarly, we can see that this region is above the original region, and that indicates that the more productive species has to have relatively higher fitness than simply required for it to coexist. Finally, we can consider what happens when we make the species have a more similar function when growing alone. And we see that that makes the over-yield region larger. And so a third and final component which promotes over-yielding is when species are similar in productivity. So combining these three components, we come up with something known as functional coexistence theory, which predicts positive effects of diversity on ecosystem function using these three components: niche differentiation, fitness function relationship, and functional equalization. Niche differentiation ensures that species compete less with individuals of other species, of heterospecifics, and that means that diverse communities are less negatively affected by competition. This is in line with our traditional understanding of the drivers of positive diversity effects. On the other hand, the fitness function relationship means that more productive species are also better competitors. And as a result, competition will select for higher productivity. And we can see this here by varying the fitness ratio between two species, where species one, that's moving right, is the more productive. And we see that the biomass of the entire system is maximized when species one has higher fitness than its competitor. But that this fitness advantage can't be too extreme, or else we don't get over-yielding because of competitive exclusion. So the species no longer coexist when the fitness ratio is too extreme. Finally, functional equalization means that species have similar levels of productivity, making it less likely an unproductive species will dominate the system. And we show in this preprint, which you can check out and should hopefully be published in ecological monographs in a couple of weeks, or it's just been accepted. This can be applied to models and to real data. And so we apply it to data set from Whedon and Tillman at Cedar Creek, where they competed two grass species along a nitrogen gradient. And we can visualize the conditions for over-yielding and coexistence across different nitrogen levels, as well as the differences in the actual niche and fitness differences experienced by the community. What we see is that though shifting nitrogen changes the coexistence outcome from competitive exclusion by one species to coexistence to dominance by the other species, we never have over-yielding. And in this case, it's because of a missing fitness function relationship. So that more productive species in green, which is POA, never has a strong enough fitness advantage for it to be able to cause over-yielding. And so we see that this two-species framework already gives useful insight into empirical systems. In summary, we started from this black box where we know that species have positive abundances, but we don't know what they are. And we've derived this quantitative relationship relating the invasion growth rate, or the invasion-based fitness F, and the function in isolation, the function of going alone, or K, to the equilibrium abundance of a species. And we've shown that this allows us to link these community and ecosystem scales of biological organization. Next, I'll extend this to more sort of realistic models by considering something known as non-additivity. And for now, we'll stick to the two-species case. So we know that competition doesn't always follow the simple models that we write as theoreticians, of course. And so one example we have is an experiment from the 70s where two species of flies were competed. And due to the behavioral interactions between these flies, the researchers observed these nonlinearities in the system that aren't captured by traditional models. Similarly, my postdoc advisor, Boruka, and I have proposed that we should expect similar nonlinear complex dynamics when performing plant-soil feedback experiments, also due to the interaction between different processes, in this case, plant-plant competition and plant-microbe interactions. And so we could expect that in a lot of systems, we might need to depart from the assumptions of these classic models. And we sort of formalize this using the idea of additivity. What this means, additivity, is that we can predict the total effect of combining two sets of individuals simply by knowing their individual effects. So in this example, we can predict the total competitive effect of communities 3 and 4 on that focal species, based simply on the competitive responses of subcommunities 1 and 2. And this turns out to be very general. So I've illustrated it for the local Terra model, but it also works, for instance, for the Beaverton Pulp model used to model annual plant competition, as well as a variety of other classic models of research competition and so on. And we contrast that with a non-additive model. And this is a case where we cannot predict the total impact of communities in the same way. It turns out that if you look across the literature, almost all of the models that are commonly fitted, particularly to plant data, are additive. And so in the 80s, for instance, this list of 8 models for two-species plant competition was proposed, and all but one are additive. And we see a similar list and a similar outcome in 2024 of a reanalysis of a modern coexistence plant experiment, where only one of these very diverse models actually has non-additive competitive effects according to the definition which is presented. And on one hand, this is a good thing, right? So the results I showed in the previous section should be relatively general, or at least they should match the kinds of models that we have as our best effort for fitting most systems. On the other hand, it means that even though we're comparing a large number of models in these cases, for instance, most of these models will share certain commonalities in their dynamics, and we might be missing out on certain kinds of outcomes, as I'll show next. And as an interesting cautionary note, the authors found that these two models, one additive and one not additive, both had the lowest AIC value. And though they preferred the additive model in this case, I believe, this is a sort of cautionary tale that tells us that it can be quite hard to distinguish these two types of models, at least using our current experimental designs. But in any case, we'd like to know what the consequences of these non-additivities are for community composition, structure, and function. And so to do so, we'll consider first the log-level Terra model. On the left, we have the growth responses to different abundances of competitors. On the right, we have the classic Zingies, the zero net growth isoclines, showing the combinations of population densities that give zero population growth. And so this is a log-level Terra model. We add now a term that adds a non-additive competitive effect. And we see that in this case, that non-additive effect increases the relative abundance of one species against its competitor. In this case, species 1 is favored by this nonlinearity. Similarly, these non-additive effects can reduce or increase the total function of a community, or they can change the stability. Here we have a bifurcation of one stable equilibrium into bistable coexistence outcomes. However, in all of these cases, this invasion growth, this common currency of coexistence, remains unchanged. And what this shows that even though non-additivity can affect these community properties, it has no independent effect on coexistence. In other words, we can think of non-additive as decoupling coexistence from community properties. However, as I'll show, the results I showed earlier for additive systems can still serve as a starting point for understanding these more complex and realistic non-additive effects. So for instance, we use this functional coexistence framework from the last section. We plot niche and fitness difference on the X and Y axes. And now for each community, which is a point in this space, we will visualize its relative abundance of species 1 according to color. So blue indicates that 1 dominates, and red indicates that 2 dominates. And so in the additive case, we have this, and we add a non-additivity to the model. As expected, that non-additivity favors species 1 by allowing it to dominate the community at a larger range of niche and fitness differences. Moreover, we can quantify the degree to which species 1 benefits from this non-additivity by taking the difference between these two plots. And so we see that at all niche and fitness ratios, species 1 is benefiting, but that it's strongest in a certain region of that space. And we can understand this using an an analytical result from a perturbation analysis showing that the final abundance of a species accounting for these non-additive effects can be understood through the additive condition added to some non-additive effect. And indeed, this can be a useful way of looking at empirical data and empirical systems, and using a system where different plants were competed with mycorrhizal partners. We identified these with my collaborator, Claire Willing, and I identified a hump-shaped competitive response to intraspecific competition in the pine seedlings that were used in this experiment. And using that non-additive response, we then quantified the contribution of non-additivity to the relative abundance of pines. And sort of matching our previous expectation from this theoretical analysis, non-additivity always benefits the pines. And the degree to which that occurs depends on the specific nature and fitness differences in the system. So in summary, we've sort of started from this additive case, and we've now shown that it's possible to understand the effect of non-additive competitive interactions by adding some correction onto that. So in principle, our theory can also extend to models beyond the classic Lockwood-Volterra-like systems. And now finally, I'd like to discuss how we can use tools from statistical mechanics, from physics, in order to produce a unified theory that now generalizes these findings to larger communities of many, many more than 2 species. And so as we did before, our goal is to understand the interior equilibrium in terms of the invasion growth rates. In this case, there's a solution inspired by statistical physics, which is a look at the entire invasion process of that invading species. So instead of this perspective we have on the left, where we just look at the growth rate of the species while rare, we look now at the entire process. So as the invading species increases, it decreases the abundance of the resident or residents, and at some point reaches an equilibrium, which will correspond to its final equilibrium abundance in the entire system. However, when we have more than 2 species, the resident is not a species, but rather a community. And that means that the abundance of the invader can also change the composition of that community. And these complex feedbacks between invader abundance and community structure can then make it very hard to calculate the overall impact of the resident community on the invader. Fortunately, we can solve this problem using tools from statistical physics. And in particular, I want to refer to a body of work known as disordered systems. And as shown here in this example figure, disordered systems are systems in which interactions are unstructured and random, but persistent over time. So in this example of magnetic spins, for instance, the correlations between these spins are random, and the correlations stay fixed. And this makes it very hard to calculate the overall properties of the system, because we can't simply average out these random interactions because they're persistent over time. Fortunately, there are several tools for dealing with this kind of problem. And so these have already had a lot of success in ecology. For instance, May's classic results linking community stability to community size use a body of work from disordered systems known as random matrix theory. More recently, a method was proposed known as the cavity method, and this provides an even more general approach for solving these kinds of disordered system models. And as we'll see, this can greatly simplify our analysis of Lockwood-Volterra and other models of competition. And to do so, we remove one species from the system, and that creates this cavity, which is why it's known as the cavity method. And the interactions between that species and the remaining species through this cavity end up being much more simple to solve than the original full system. The version that was proposed in 2018 for the Lockwood-Volterra looks like this. So we start from some initial equilibrium from which our focal species, the invader, is absent. Then we add this average invader species. We approximate its feedbacks with each resident species. We approximate the feedbacks of the entire resident community. And finally, we use that approximate feedback to solve for the equilibrium abundance distribution of this average species. And while this has been done, my goal here today is to focus on the biological intuition and the connections to classic coexistence theory. And in doing so, to answer this question, trying to link equilibrium abundance to invasion growth rates. And so the first step, starting from this community without the invader, this is simply the resident community from coexistence theory. So that's great. We have sort of the same starting point for both methods. Next, we add this invader species. And again, there are close parallels between these two methods. In both cases, this species can only successfully join the community and reach positive abundance if it has positive invasion growth rate or invasion-based fitness. Next, and here's where it gets more complex, is we approximate the effect that this new invader species has on the residents as it becomes more abundant in the community. To do so, we model the effect of that invader as a press perturbation. So we fix the abundance of species 0, and as we increase it, we see that the resident species decrease to different degrees. And it turns out that we can represent this pretty well as a linear function of the abundance, the press perturbed abundance of the invader species. In turn, substituting that into the condition for equilibrium, we get an overall expression that allows us to solve for equilibrium abundance. And we note that there are several close connections between this expression and classic coexistence theory. So first, we have fitness, as we mentioned before, or the scaled invasion growth rate, which determines the ability of a species to reach positive abundance. We have this ratio of competition coefficients here, and this is the pairwise niche overlap. This is exactly the same measure that we use for 2 species. And so now we have left and right-hand sides of this equation, and we can visualize the solution graphically. And so on the x-axis, we'll show the press perturbed abundance of the invader. And for each invader abundance, we'll let the residents reach some equilibrium, and then we'll evaluate the effect that those residents at their equilibrium have on the invader in turn. So this is the feedback between invaders and residents. And we see that this curve starts from a y-intercept that represents this invasion growth rate. Moreover, at the point where this feedback is exactly canceled out by the intrinsic growth rate and self-limitation of the invader species, we find that this is the point giving the final abundance of the species. And this gives the expression on the right, which is the exact link that we were searching for, linking invasion and equilibrium. Importantly, this term in the denominator is something known in statistical mechanics as self-averaging, and that means that its variance becomes small as the number of species becomes very large. And so we can replace that with its community-wide average. And it turns out that if we do some simulations, we see that these predictions we made mathematically hold for these real communities, and so, or these real simulations. And so we see that the feedback between the one species as invader and the residents is linear as expected. And moreover, that the slopes of these feedbacks are nearly identical, regardless of which species is the invader. So with that in mind, we can define this quantity, invader-resident feedback. And this summarizes the feedbacks that occur after invasion. So as a species becomes more positive, it reduces the abundance of residents, and that in turn reduces the competitive impact felt by the invader. This serves as a multi-species analog of niche difference for large systems. And we can apply these methods that we've developed to real systems as well. So in one example, we take data from this 8-species biodiversity experiment. We select the largest coexisting subcommunity, which happens to be 5 species, and then we perform the same calculations. So we sort of using the fitted competition coefficients, we fix the abundance of the invader, and we evaluate these feedbacks. What we see then is that, as before, the feedbacks are quite linear, and that the slope of those feedbacks are quite consistent. As a result, we can then predict the actual biomass of these species at equilibrium with near perfect accuracy, simply using information about their invasion-based fitness, F, and their productivity when going alone, K. We can also do the same thing for a microbial community consisting of 5 species. And we see that though these feedbacks are less regular, these curves are less straight lines. This emerges because one species experiences facilitation from the other species. However, we still see, on the right-hand side, that there's a close relationship between the abundance predicted using invasion growth rate and the actual abundance observed. And so we have evidence that these these consistent feedbacks that we identified provide a way to link invasion growth rates to equilibrium abundance in multi-species community. That is, the abundance of a species depends on its invasion-based fitness and on its function when growing alone, just as in the two-species case, and moreover, now in the multi-species case, on a quantity that we've defined as the invader-resident feedback. This provides the route towards this unified theory that I've been promising. And I'll show a couple of quick examples of things that we're working on now in order to demonstrate its applicability to different scales of ecological inference. So first, we might consider if this can help us model microbial diversity in biogeochemical models. And so here we consider a model of microbes competing for two resources, nitrogen and carbon. And the features of this model are drawn from recommendations or suggestions for the next generation of our system model microbial submodels, as I've reviewed in the synthesis here in 2022. And so, for instance, we have saturating uptake of carbon and nitrogen by each microbe. We have carbon and nitrogen stoichiometry following the law of the minimum. And we have, as suggested in 2017, density-dependent mortality, which is a new term that's supposed to introduce more realistic microbial population dynamics. And combining these, we have a pretty complex model. So it's sort of, you would expect that maybe the relationships that we derived earlier for more simple models would not hold for such a complex model. But in fact, when we do the analysis of invader-resident feedbacks and we relate the invasion growth rate and the final abundance of species, we see the exact same trends that we saw in the simpler analyses before. And so we see these regular invader-resident feedbacks despite complexity, and we see consistent relationships between invasion growth rate and species abundance. So this suggests that that the theory that we've developed using these simpler cases can generalize to more complex models, including things like, for instance, these non-additive uptake responses to resources, and that they can also help us achieve tasks at larger scale, such as incorporating realistic amounts of microbial diversity into Earth system models. Another result that we find is that these results can provide a multi-species framework for coexistence. And so moving from the two-species case where we have two quantities and fitness differences, we now have a statistical distribution of different fitnesses or invasion growths across the entire large community. And the statistical moments of this distribution can then help us predict coexistence, just as niche and fitness help us in two-species case. In particular, we look at the ratio of the average fitness to its variation. And when the average fitness is large relative to variation, we predict that a larger proportion of species will coexist. And so what we've done here then is to generalize these coexistence metrics to very large communities using this idea of statistical distribution. Finally, we can then sort of work towards a unified framework that predicts coexistence, structure, and function. And so these species that have positive fitnesses are the ones that persist at positive abundance in the species. And they also have a certain unique distribution of function or productivity, K. As a result, we can then consider this joint distribution of fitness and function and use it to predict community properties. For instance, using that relationship we derived earlier, we can then calculate the total functioning of the community, which crucially, these relationships can be parameterized using a few standard invasion and function measurements. So as opposed to fully parameterizing interactions in the system, which is quadratic in the number of species, we now have a quicker way of potentially quantifying the underlying relationships between species in large communities. And this helps us generalize these relationships between coexistence and ecosystem function to large communities. For instance, we could apply this to biodiversity experiment data. And so, for instance, we derived, using the same approach, an expression for evenness in terms of these same statistical moments of the joint distribution. And we find that, for instance, both of these expressions contain a term for the covariance between fitness and function. And in current work with my collaborator, Iris Hardijk, we've shown that if communities show a positive relationship between fitness and function, we expect that this will produce a negative relationship between evenness and functioning. This is unintuitive because generally we expect diversity to have a positive relationship with ecosystem functioning. However, as we show using this grassland data set I showed earlier, when you have this positive relationship between fitness and function, you should instead expect that evenness, a component of diversity, should have a negative effect on functioning. And so summarizing all these results, we introduce coexistence theory, and then we generalize it to this multi-species case using the idea of statistical distributions of fitness. Then we showed in 2 species and using classical models that coexistence can be fundamentally and tightly linked to ecosystem function, and we generalize this idea to the multi-species case using these joint distributions of fitness and function. Finally, we show that these results can hold for non-additive models if you consider the specific effect of nonlinearities. And using simulations of nonlinear models in large communities, we show that the results we've derived for large communities hold also for models with nonlinearities. Taken together, these results then help us generalize ecological insight across different scales. And so summarizing what we've done here today, we've gone from modern coexistence theory, which answers the question, how do species interactions maintain diversity in small communities? We've gone from modern coexistence theory then to functional coexistence theory for large communities. And now we're able to answer questions such as, how does the maintenance of diversity in species-rich communities affect their structure and function? With that, I'd like to thank you for your time and open the floor to any questions. Thanks.